I am. Just two little words, right? But in the context of the story we're unpacking today, they're literally the spark that ignites a terrifying reality. Picture this, a pristine sheet of linen rag, a completely unwritten horizon. Then, a lone scribe dips his steel quill into an inkwell and makes this pivotal existential declaration. But here's the catch. By asserting his own identity, by writing those exact words, he inadvertently births a dark, binding reality straight out of nothingness.
So, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're descending into a truly grim, dark, gothic parable known as the Ink Blot of High Time. Now, this isn't just your standard fantasy story. It's actually a profound psychological deep dive into Fichtean and Nietzscheanian philosophy, all wrapped up in a haunting fable. We're going to explore exactly what happens when human consciousness tries to break its own structural limits. And, we'll map out every single twist of this philosophical labyrinth along the way.
Section 1. The Scribe's Divided Quill. Let's start right at the genesis of this confinement. We're placing ourselves directly in the unwritten horizon of high time, just before the text was hardened by the king's law. Imagine the scribe sitting in a limestone chamber measuring exactly 6 paces by 4. When he dipped his quill and declared, "I am," he didn't just scribble a sentence, he instantly materialized his own cell. He created the paper, the heavy stone walls, the desk, basically his ultimate limitation. In Fichtean philosophy, by asserting his own identity, the I, he accidentally created the not I. That's the physical world that limits and binds his freedom. So, he trapped himself in a prison entirely of his own making.
Section 2. The Knight's Iron Word.
You see, the scribe didn't just create walls. His creation cast a very long, very dark shadow. Enter the armored knight. Now, for centuries, this knight stood as the absolute baseline of reality, predictable, cold, and honestly, utterly dead. He represents what the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche called the historical dragon. He's burdened by this heavy concept of du musst, which translates to thou shalt. It's the static, crushing grammar of morality. But to break this self-made confinement, the scribe's own rebellious thoughts manifested into something entirely different. They became a kinetic eruption of ich will, or I will. This kinetic eruption is a direct, in-your-face challenge to the rigid language and laws of the empire.
Section 3. The Jester's Sapphire Rebellion.
This I will takes the form of a snarling, blue-eyed creature, the Jester of Sapphire Light. And get this, he was born directly from the friction of the ink on the paper, specifically designed to tear up the very canvas that held him captive. His eyes burn with this sapphire light, which is a physical manifestation of red licklickite. That's a severe intellectual honesty that Nietzsche prized above literally all other virtues. So the key takeaway here is that the Jester is not some external destroyer attacking the kingdom from the outside. No, he's the internal immune response. He's a truth-telling monster built right into the system, meant to violently challenge all the polite institutional fabrications of the state and expose the rot hiding underneath all that gilding.
Section 4. The Ink Blot Dissolution. Now, the Jester looks around at his mechanical surroundings and just weeps with this terrible, mocking laughter. He realizes that his fierce rebellion isn't actually free will at all. It's just a built-in, cyclical function meant to clear the canvas every 500 years. Crazy, right? So, desperate to escape this loop, he climbs up to the peak of the cathedral, the holy meeting place. And this is where the exact sequence of the apocalypse unfolds. Step 1, the friction of the ink leads to him meeting his ancient predecessor, who is holding a wet drop of raw, unshaped potentiality called the ink blot of high time. Step 2, their clawed fingers touch, the localized rebel, what we call the not I, slams directly into the primordial creator, the absolute I. And finally, step 3, the definitive lines of the world just instantly dissolve.
Think about the shocking aftermath of that touch. It's the total collapse of absolute order. The definitive ink lines in those grand Art Deco towers of the kingdom's pride, they dissolve in an instant. They violently transform into rusted Arthurian armor and a dark, fractured purgatory. It really shows that when human consciousness tries to break its own structural limits, it forces the whole world back into a dark Camelot psychodrama. It proves that reality isn't carved in stone. Actually, scratch that, it's more like it's just a temporary script written on a very fragile canvas.
Section 5. A Fichtean Deep Dive.
Let's pause the destruction for a quick second to analyze the underlying philosophy of this uncanny jester. His very nature is to turn aside and speak directly to us, the audience. And he recites this confession to us: I am the not self the self cannot abide. If you think back to the scribe in his cell, the jester is revealing himself as the negation baked directly into the scribe's dream. He is the absolutely necessary opposite.
He goes on to say, the truth, the self posits and then tries to hide. This brilliantly captures the great lesson of the jester's science. The very thing the kingdom, or the self, denies the loudest is precisely what belongs to it. The jester represents all those inconvenient truths that a rigid society desperately tries to sweep under the rug.
But then he foreshadows his own ultimate philosophical trap. The jester who reveals what reason hides must one day stand before the mirror's gaze. You see, by exposing the kingdom's lies, the jester is also kept. He too has something between his mask and his face. He's destined to face his own unvarnished truth because the mirror he raises doesn't choose sides. It reflects everything.
Let's quickly map out this incredible dialectical fable. Think of it like a giant puzzle. First, you have the self. That's the scribe asserting his existence and creating the kingdom. Then you have the not-self, the localized rebel, the jester, pushing back against that rigid structure. And finally, you have the absolute, the primordial ink blot of unshaped potentiality. The apocalypse basically happened because the not-self slammed directly into the absolute, completely shattering the reality the self had so carefully written.
Section 6. The Mirror's Heavy Burden. We are now entering the high-contrast gray twilight of the unwritten lands for the story's tragic psychological conclusion. The jester is standing on unrefined stone, literally reaching through the fourth wall to challenge the very grammar of the empire's self-belief. But consider this specific detail from the text. Golden bells hang frozen against his collar. It's a deeply tragic visual of the Fichtean trap, because despite his cosmic rebellion, he remains fundamentally tethered to the very knight of the iron word who shadows his every step. He's still bound by the meticulous ink of that ancient scribe.
Let's think about the heavy psychological weight the jester carries right here. He proclaims the old gods are just hollow iron shells. He uses his unhinged, roaring laughter as a surgical weapon to strip the canvas entirely bare of institutional lies. But in doing so, he has to look into the terrifying mirror of his own mind. He realizes his predetermined purpose right at the very edge of the abyss. Once the icons are shattered, the ultimate burden of meaning falls entirely upon the creator.
And so the jester twists his body towards you, reaching his clawed fingers out. The old scripts are completely washed away. He leaves us suspended in this gray twilight, demanding an answer. Will you collapse into the comfort of old chains, or step into the terrifying, beautiful freedom of an unwritten horizon? The heavy burden of writing the next line falls entirely upon those brave enough to hold the quill. So thank you for exploring this fascinating fable with me, and I'll leave you with this. What ink are you using to write your own reality?